In the darkest place in human history, a psychiatrist discovered something that changed psychology forever. The people who survived weren't the strongest. They were the ones who found a reason to. His name was Viktor Frankl. He was a Viennese neurologist and psychiatrist who entered Auschwitz in 1944 and emerged, barely alive, in 1945. He lost his wife, his mother, his father, and his brother. He lost the manuscript of his life's work. He lost everything a person can lose while still drawing breath. And from that loss, from inside it, not after it, he arrived at an insight so simple that it has been misquoted, oversimplified, and turned into motivational posters ever since. But the insight itself, before the world got hold of it, is one of the most important things anyone has ever said about the human condition. Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. He did not invent that line. He borrowed it from Nietzsche, but he proved it with his body. To understand what Frankl discovered, you have to understand what he brought into the camps, because he did not arrive empty-handed. By the time the Nazis deported him, he had already spent 2 decades thinking about meaning. Frankl was born in Vienna in 1905, into the intellectual world that had produced Freud and Adler. He was precocious. He began corresponding with Freud at the age of 16, and Freud was impressed enough to submit one of Frankl's papers for publication. As a medical student, Frankl organized free counseling centers for teenagers in Vienna. During the years these centers operated, the city recorded 0 student suicides for the first time. He trained under Freud and then under Alfred Adler, but eventually broke with both. Freud said the primary drive was pleasure. Adler said it was power. Frankl disagreed with both. He believed the primary human drive was neither pleasure nor power, it was meaning. He called his approach logotherapy, from the Greek logos, meaning, reason, purpose. By the late 1930s, Frankl had developed most of this theory. He had a completed manuscript. He had a psychiatric practice. He had a wife, Tilly, whom he had married in 1941. He had an American visa. He could have emigrated. But his elderly parents could not get visas. Frankl chose to stay with them. In 1942, the family was deported. Frankl spent 3 years in 4 different concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau. He worked as a slave laborer. He contracted typhus. He was separated from everyone he loved, and he did not know, for most of that time, who among them was still alive. He later wrote about this period in a book called Man's Search for Meaning, first published in German in 1946 under the title Trotzdem Ja zum Leben sagen, saying yes to life in spite of everything. The English translation, published in 1959, has sold over 16 million copies. It is one of the most influential books of the 20th century. What makes the book extraordinary is not the horror, though the horror is there. It is Frankl's refusal to let the horror be the whole story. Even inside the camps, he was observing. Not with clinical detachment, but with the trained attention of a psychiatrist who could not stop asking, why do some people survive this, and others do not? The answers he arrived at were not what you might expect. Physical strength mattered, but only to a point. Frankl watched strong men collapse and frail men endure. Youth mattered, but not reliably. The patterns he noticed were not physical. They were psychological. The prisoners who survived tended to have something specific, a sense that their suffering was not the final word, that there was something beyond the wire, not in the afterlife, but in the future they still believed in. A book to finish, a child to find, a person to see again, a task that only they could complete. Frankl noticed that the moment a prisoner gave up on the future, the moment they stopped believing that something waited for them on the other side of the suffering, their body followed. Not immediately. But soon, he described it precisely, the prisoner would refuse to get up one morning. They would lie in their own filth. They would smoke their last cigarette, a currency in the camps, which meant they had stopped trading for food, which meant they had stopped planning for tomorrow. Within 48 hours they were usually dead. Not from any new illness, from the withdrawal of the will to live. Frankl watched this happen again and again, and he came to believe that what he was witnessing was not weakness, it was the absence of something essential, something more fundamental than food or shelter or rest, something without which the human organism simply cannot sustain itself. After the war, Frankl rebuilt. He remarried. He returned to psychiatry, and he formalized what the camps had shown him into a therapeutic system. Logotherapy, meaning centered therapy, rests on three core principles. First, life has meaning under all circumstances, even the most miserable. This is not optimism. Frankl was not optimistic. He had seen what human beings were capable of doing to each other, but he insisted from experience, not from theory, that meaning can be found even in suffering, even in loss, even at the very edge of annihilation. Not because suffering is good, but because the human capacity to choose a response to suffering is irreducible. It is the last freedom, the one that cannot be taken away. Second, the primary motivation of human beings is the will to meaning. Not the will to pleasure, as Freud said, not the will to power, as Adler and Nietzsche said, the will to meaning. Frankl argued that when this drive is frustrated, when a person cannot find or create meaning in their life, the result is what he called an existential vacuum, a state of emptiness, boredom, and diffuse anxiety that no amount of pleasure or success can fill. He believed this vacuum was the defining psychological condition of the modern world. Third, we are free to find meaning in every situation, not free to choose our circumstances. Frankl, of all people, did not romanticize that, but free to choose our attitude toward those circumstances. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, he wrote. The last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This is logotherapy in its essence, helping a person find the meaning that is uniquely theirs. Frankl identified three ways that a person can discover meaning. The first is through creation, through what you give to the world, a piece of work, a craft, a contribution, something that exists because you made it. This is the path most people instinctively understand. You find meaning by building something that matters. The second is through experience, through what you receive from the world. A sunset, a piece of music, a conversation that changes how you see everything, the love of another person. Frankl considered this form of meaning just as profound as the first. You do not need to produce anything. Sometimes meaning arrives simply through the quality of your attention. The third, and this is the one that distinguishes Frankl from nearly every other psychologist, is through suffering. Not by seeking suffering and not by romanticizing it, but by finding in unavoidable suffering a reason to endure it. This was the path Frankl himself walked in the camps. When there was nothing to create and nothing beautiful to experience, there was still the possibility of bearing the unbearable with dignity, of choosing, in the face of absolute horror, to remain human. He told a story in his lectures that captures this. A man came to him after the war, devastated by the death of his wife. He could not move on. He could not see the point. Frankl asked him, "What would have happened if you had died first and your wife had survived?" The man said, "That would have been terrible. She would have suffered enormously." Frankl replied, "You see, she has been spared that suffering. But the price is that you must survive and mourn her." The man said nothing. He shook Frankl's hand and left. His suffering had not changed, but it now had a meaning. Now the necessary pushback, because there is a way of reading Frankl that becomes its own burden. If suffering always has meaning, does that mean you should accept it? Does it mean you should not fight against injustice, poverty, abuse? Does finding meaning in suffering become a tool for telling people to endure what should be resisted? Frankl was clear about this, though his clarity is sometimes lost in the quotation culture that surrounds his work. He never said suffering was necessary for meaning. He said that when suffering is unavoidable, when you have exhausted every possibility of removing it, then and only then does the question of meaning within suffering become relevant. He explicitly warned against unnecessary suffering, calling it masochism, not heroism. There is also the question of whether meaning can be manufactured. Can you really choose to find purpose in any situation, or is that a fantasy that only works for extraordinary individuals? Frankl would answer that the capacity is universal, even if the practice is difficult. He did not promise that finding meaning would be easy. He promised it was possible. And he pointed to the evidence of the camps, to people who had every reason to give up and did not, as proof that the capacity exists, even under conditions that no human being should ever face. The danger is not Frankl's framework. The danger is the flattened version of it, the one that turns find meaning into another productivity hack, another self-help bullet point, stripped of the gravity that gave it birth. Frankl predicted our era with uncomfortable precision. He said that the primary illness of the 20th century was not neurosis in Freud's sense, not repressed desire. It was the existential vacuum, a pervasive sense of meaninglessness that would express itself not as dramatic despair but as boredom, addiction, aggression, and a frantic pursuit of pleasure to fill the void. He said this in the 1950s, before the internet, before the attention economy, before it became possible to spend an entire evening scrolling through other people's lives while your own sat untouched in the next room. The existential vacuum is not a diagnosis for the desperate. It is a diagnosis for the comfortable. It is what happens when every material need is met, and the question, "What is all this for?" has no answer. It is the epidemic of meaning, the one no amount of optimization, no app, no morning routine can cure, because the cure is not efficiency, the cure is purpose. And purpose, Frankl insists, cannot be given to you. It can only be found by you, for you, in the particular and unrepeatable circumstances of your one life. Viktor Frankl died in 1997 at the age of 92. He had rebuilt his practice. He had published 39 books. He had lectured on every continent. He had earned a pilot's license at the age of 67. He had climbed mountains well into his 80s. He had lived the fullest possible answer to the question the camps had asked him. But the thing I keep returning to is not the accomplishments. It is the moment he described in Man's Search for Meaning, the moment when, on a forced march in the bitter cold, stumbling over frozen ground in the dark, he found himself thinking about his wife. He did not know if she was alive. He would later learn she was not. But in that moment, he thought of her face with such intensity that he felt she was present, and he realized in his words that the salvation of man is through love and in love. Not love as a feeling, love as a direction, as the thing you orient your life toward when everything else has been stripped away. The examined life asks you to search, relentlessly, honestly, for what makes your existence mean something, not in the abstract. Specifically, what is the work that only you can do? Who is the person whose suffering you can ease? What is the thing that, if you did not do it, would leave a hole in the world shaped exactly like you? Frankl found his answer in the worst place on earth. You probably will not have to look that far, but you do have to look.